this part Q&A discussion as well. Alan was ambiguous when he told me to be the chair. He said I could be chair or discussant. I could serve either role. But I think given the way that the two papers talk to each other literally, I think it might be useful first to allow Ian Taylor first to respond to the points brought up by Yuan-horng, and then after that I want to use my privilege to just make a few comments and questions, and then we can open that to a general discussion.
Okay, thank you for the comments, and I'll just try to respond to some of them. So my general point would be that my paper is not a specific critique of China. It's more a critique of the global capitalist system. And as China enters that system, or has entered that system, then the dynamics of the system will shape how China interacts with Africa and other parts of the world. And so the critique is not specifically anti-China, as it were. It would be a critique of any major actor in Africa and how they behave, and the conditions, the structural conditions that shape that relationship. I think with regards to Australia being reliant upon exports, but also developing at the same time, I think you can't really compare Australia and Africa, because Australia was a settler colony, and the nature of capitalism as it was developed in Australia was very, very different from how capitalism developed in Africa. So they're not comparable. Although Australia does show the danger of being reliant on one country too much, as you said, 30% of the exports went to China, and of course the Chinese no longer need that input, then Australia is vulnerable and their economy has been damaged to a certain extent. I think the idea of if you think about the periphery and the semi-periphery, these are not, there's a heterogeneity to this. There are different types of peripheral and semi-peripheral countries within the wider scheme of this kind of these titles of these sectors. So in that sense, China may be dependent upon the United States to a certain extent, as you pointed out. But when China behaves or plays in Africa, when China's role in Africa is studied, then China plays the role of a semi-periphery country, or the relationship between China and African countries actually becomes very similar to core periphery countries. And I think that's the point, is that this heterogeneity is there. With regards to the opinion polls of Africans who are favourable to China, I personally wouldn't really take them very seriously, because you have to look at what the questions were. I mean, was the question, has China brought cheap consumer products to the Congo, therefore is China a good thing? Then most people say yes. If the question was, do you believe that China is contributing to structural change in the Congo? I'm sure the answer would be no. So the opinion polls are based on people in the street, really, perhaps with very little knowledge of what's actually happening, and who are basing their initial opinions on the immediate thing they see before them, which might be a cheap Chinese pair of shoes, or Chinese trousers or something. But that doesn't really tell you the real nature of the relationship between China and Africa. It just tells you some popular things. And I think if the people who are asked these questions are asked different questions, as in, is China contributing to the structural diversification of Congo and industrialization of the Congo, you would get a different set of answers. With regards to Dambisa Moyo, the problem with Dambisa Moyo is that she's an out-and-out neoliberal, ex-World Bank employee, and a propagandist for the free market across Africa. Her book, Dead Aid, her book, Dead Aid, was basically a dogmatic expression that the free market will solve all of Africa's problems. And if you look at what Dambisa Moyo is saying about the African relationship with China, she has simply restated Ricardo's position on comparative advantage, and trying to argue that Africa should use its so-called comparative advantage of, say, having lots of oil to extract benefits from China. That's all very well, but that does not, again, contribute to diversification and development, industrialization in Africa. So I personally, I mean, we can disagree on this, but I personally would not take Dambisa Moyo seriously at all. And even her own former supervisor at Oxford, who's actually Paul Collier, who's not exactly a radical, completely disowns Moyo these days. The Broughton quote comparing China and Japan, although it's a very nice quote, I don't think you can compare China in 1978 with Africa. The differences, the structural condition of the Chinese economy, the legacy of the revolution, the nature of Chinese culture and civilization and the history of China itself, plus the dynamics of the region in which China found itself after 1949, the Cold War, etc. All of this means that it's comparing apples and oranges. You can't compare China with Africa. China escaped, for various reasons, most of the effects of colonization and imperialism which Africa experienced. China was not fully occupied by the colonialists, right? Only the treaty ports. The history of China's experience and China's encounter with European imperialism is very different from the African experience. Of course, China was affected, I'm not denying that at all, but it was affected in a different way than African countries were affected. You know? So again, I don't think Bradford's quote is particularly useful. I know, to be honest, I've seen her speak a lot of times, and she always starts a talk with that quote, and then moves on to Africa, seamlessly onto Africa, as if they're comparable. And I've seen many people raise their hands during the question time and say, are you seriously comparing China in 1978 to the DRC in 2019, or Angola? And actually, going back to Moyo's point, where she said, you know, the exchange relationship between China and Africa is well understood by the Chinese and the Africans, and so if they're entering into a voluntary process, then what's the problem? Well, my critique of that position would be, actually, the African governments are not entering into this relationship to benefit their citizens. Most of these governments, not all of them, but most of these governments. Most of these governments are entering into this relationship for their own, very often, personal benefit through corruption, right? And we see, for example, with many of these contracts which are given to Chinese companies as part of the Belt and Road, and the railway between Mombasa and Nairobi is a classic example of this. The contracts are overinflated because what's happening is the Chinese contractors are going into business with Kenyan politicians behind the scenes, raising up the contract price, and it's party time for the Chinese contractor and the Kenyan politicians because they're getting 10%, 20%, or whatever. But you can't say that that's for the benefit of Kenya or ordinary Kenyans, you know? So the contract between China and Africa is to the benefit of certain people and certain interests, both on the Chinese side and on the African side. But certainly on the African side, which I know more than the Chinese side, I would say generally it's not in the generalized interests of Africans or African society as a whole. It's in the interests of certain individuals who hold positions of power and influence in the different African governments. And that makes it very difficult, not only for China, but for any foreign actor engaging with these governments. Because these governments, we assume, using our biases, our baggage, we assume that governments are there to serve the people and to serve the long-term interests of the people, right? That might be a very naive thing, but we do assume that they're there to represent the people. But unfortunately, in a number of African countries, and of course it varies from country to country, but certainly in some African countries, the elites there are absolutely not there representing the people. They don't care about development. What they're interested in is short-term goals and short-term gains from acting as gatekeepers to the external economy. And in those circumstances, the idea of some sort of voluntary interaction between Africa as a unit and China as a unit, which Moyo implies, which means it's voluntary, so therefore, what's the problem? Falls apart, because the ordinary African citizen has zero say in this, has no influence in this process, and very often is excluded, deliberately or otherwise, from any benefits that result from this interaction.
Just want to just make just two main points, two main questions. I think one thing that's interesting is we get sort of two versions of dependency, or sort of two interpretations of dependency. So we have Kara talking about dependency in critical terms, more in terms of dependency theory, world systems, and then Yuan-horng kind of responding with sort of the moral philosophy of dependency. And it's kind of interesting to put that into conversation with some of the neo-Tianxia theorists to kind of refer back this morning, people talking about relationality and methodological relationalism. But the reason I bring that up is because I wondered if Ita could talk a little bit more about how you see the relationship between the way these relationships are being pursued, say, between China or other so-called emerging powers and African states. And in the 1970s, the 1960s, the new economic order, or the attempts in that period to try to build alternative, before there was the use of the term South-South, there were attempts to try to build these horizontal linkages. And so I'm thinking if you look at Julius Nyerere in Tanzania, in 1970, at the time when China was helping Tanzania build the railway from Zambia to the port of Dar es Salaam, Nyerere was saying, in order for us to become autonomous, in order for us to become more independent from Europe, we should be sourcing our industrial products from other developing countries, and maybe there'll be complementarity. So he even asked in his speech, well, what does China produce? And he said, bicycles. And so there was some of that conversation. I don't know, I believe Samir Amin had some similar concept. Maybe I might be misunderstanding that. But of course, what's the relationship between that particular moment of building a so-called alternative form of complementarity, sort of complementarity which would reinforce autonomy, versus what's happening today? And that relates to this question of, if this is just being reproduced, if this is sort of reproduction dependency, then how do we make sense of the way that the so-called idea of, new structural, the term of new structural economics, like in China, like people like Justin and Yifu is sort of, they're arguing, so there's almost this kind of recognition among some political economists in China that we're going to try to mitigate this by trying to pursue structural transformation. So the most, biggest promoter of this was Justin and Yifu saying, this is a model of, similar what Bargum is describing this. Okay. The idea that, yes, that some of that investment will go into building infrastructure, and then that infrastructure will eventually create markets, which will then allow a structural transformation to take place, similar to how China was able to structurally transform vis-a-vis Japan. And I guess your position is the opposite of that. I don't know if you think of Tang Xiaoyang as kind of in between, sort of. But that's the first question. Sort of, how do you interpret that sort of logic of some Chinese policymakers or scholars who sort of acknowledge the problem of dependency or claim at least that there's something different in just terms of like blood cell finance. So these are new concepts that are being developed. And for Yuan-horng, I think the question I have relates to the title of your talk, which is Behind the Facade. And that was interesting to me because I didn't read your paper till this morning, so I had a different expectation of what I would find. But one thing that's interesting about discourse about, especially in China and Africa, is this language of facades. And so, on the one hand, you have the discourse which is critical of China's presence, which sort of, I see the facade as the good story, win-win as a facade.
Yes.
Bandung is a facade. The reality is exploitation. But what's interesting is that there's another discourse emanating from people like Deborah Brautigam, but also from Chinese scholars as well, which uses the same language but a different way. For them, we don't say facades, the real story versus the Western media or international media. So it's the idea that the New York Times, and that a lot of the public news that circulated globally about China is based on kind of these fantastical scandals, which in the details often turn out to be not quite, they tend to be more complicated. And so often you get this kind of debate between two different illusions. And the empirical base of that kind of gets wrapped up in this kind of technocratic developmental discourse. And so then it's really hard to find a critical perspective on China-Africa, because as soon as you begin, and this is my experience, sort of going to many conferences and watching how scholars interact with each other. Beware, I'm an anthropologist, so I'm just always going to be taking field notes on what everyone's doing. But I've noticed how sometimes, as soon as critical language comes up, even if, for example, you're critiquing global capitals around China, in some settings, people will interpret that as you returning to this narrative, which is either, oh, it's that Western narrative, how typical that a Westerner will have this critical view of China, or, oh, how typical that a Chinese scholar will have this erosive view. I mean, it's sort of the question how, so the question comes sort of, what do you see as the facade, and what do you see as a real, sort of, I don't want to say real story, but what's behind the facade? And I had a more specific comment about migrants and gratitude, but I may want to give a chance to respond, and I'll just come back to that a little bit after other people have a chance to ask questions.
Beyond the facade. Actually, I did not want to point out what is the reality behind the facade, but I'm questioning why it's inevitable, particularly from the China side, have to construct that kind of facade. Like a win-win rhetorics, if contrary to what Dependency presents, that there is a straightforward view, right? So the trade-off is well understood by African and Chinese. If that is, then there will be no such kind of need of which are full, particularly in Chinese media toward to Chinese, to construct a rosy, almost all monopolized broadcasting almost every day, to paint a rosy better role. And then the language is emphasizing the benevolence and generosity, genuine generosity, and all these things. In contrast to, actually, very interestingly, the forgettingness toward all other, for example, like the Japanese generosities in earlier stage, like in the 70s and 80s. So that part is something that will not appear, and why this kind of facade, are unavoidable. And what is that kind of effects? The effects, of course, has on the mass of the Chinese. The Chinese. So then they will have quite a different self-regard. They don't remember anything that the Japanese, the Taiwanese-based business or the Hong Kong-based business, providing us so necessary initiation at earlier stage. That part, nothing. But they will know how this generosity, benevolence toward Africans, and then the status of the Chinese live under this. And that is something that in a later stage will suffer certain kind of bitter feeling of feeling ungrateful Africa, right? Africans, yeah. I'm asking why, but this is so honest. Every day, it's everyday broadcast.
I think the kind of, what we might call the Chinese facade is not specific to China. It's a generalized expression of any country's policies. They always try to put a positive spin on what they're trying to do. They're never going to tell you what they're really doing, or they're never going to tell you any negative aspects of their policy. So I think it's entirely natural for the Chinese government to try to try to portray their relationship with Africa or Latin America or somewhere as being win-win, mutual, all that type of stuff. It's the same way as, say, American foreign policy towards the developing world would be about allegedly promoting democracy, human rights, good governance, etc. It's just part and parcel of diplomacy. The question, or the problem becomes, is when we start believing this rhetoric as if it has substance beyond simply dressing up the policies. So, in other words, it would be a mistake, I believe it would be a mistake to argue that the United States is genuinely interested in promoting democracy, human rights and good governance in Africa, just as I believe it would be a mistake to believe that China is genuinely promoting win-win, mutually beneficial relationships with Africa. There might be positives, of course, in both policies, but there will also be negatives. The question for us as academics and as students is to try to identify the positives and the negatives. And it would be an extreme position to completely denounce all American policy in Africa, just as it would be an extreme position to denounce all Chinese policy in Africa. I think we have to have a more nuanced approach to that. And I think one of the problems with somebody like Deborah Broughton and her kind of myth-busting approach to China-Africa studies is she doesn't really look at what academics are writing about China-Africa. What she does is she captures the headlines from some media story, the Land Grabs book, for example. Writes a big book, it's not actually that big, writes a book, myth-busting, debunking the idea that China is engaged in land grabs. But her sources for this allegation was simply basically media studies, not media studies, media reports in the New York Times, etc., etc. Well, we know the role of the media, right? Read Chomsky to realize what the role of the media is in the West. So, with the idea of South-South collaboration, I think it's a very interesting concept in two ways. One, if we go back to the new international economic order period for the 60s and 70s, the creation of UNCTAD, the non-aligned movement, etc., there was a degree of, I don't know how to call it, there was a degree of substance behind South-South collaboration. But I believe that as the countries in the Global South progressively started to adopt neoliberal policies, particularly after the Cancun summit in Mexico, then the substance of South-South solidarity became eroded. And Samir Amin, for example, and other critics have argued that what happened was that South-South rhetoric simply became a device to disguise what he would call bourgeois nationalism and bourgeois national projects, And the big question, whenever somebody talks about South-South cooperation these days, my question to them always is, can you explain the difference between being exploited by a British capitalist and being exploited by a Taiwanese capitalist or an Indian capitalist, right? What is the fundamental difference? Is it better to be exploited by an Indian capitalist because he's from the Global South? maybe you believe that's the case. Justin Lin, I was involved in a project with him in Ethiopia where he talked to us about his structural economics approach. And I always found it quite difficult to pin down exactly what he meant, other than essentially it was essentially World Bank orthodoxy with the added ingredient that infrastructure needed to be built in South Africa to unleash the market potential. And beyond that, I don't really see much substance to his structural economics approach. Having said all that, I do believe that infrastructure is a major challenge for African development. And if it wasn't China that was laying down infrastructure, there's very few other countries or other sources where this would come from. So I do believe that new roads, new railways are a positive thing for Africa. But my question or my concern is, what are these going to be used for? Are they going to be used for broad-based sustainable development? Or are they going to be used for either directly or indirectly for the reproduction of the tendencies which I've identified? And I think there, quite often, there is a degree of agency in terms of what the local state is and what the regime is in each individual African country, and we may have different outcomes as a result of that. So there is that possible policy space, but overall, I would still insist or would still maintain that the global system itself limits the potential for Africa to rise in the way in which perhaps people would want it to rise, certainly those in Africa.
Can you open up maybe voice first that she has to leave?
Yeah, because I have to leave at around 4:30, so I would like to raise my question first. I like your proposition very much, of course. The reading of David Harvey and Spatial Flips and the fourth capital and suffixing and expanding the territory and so on. But you said that this BRI is China's method to fix the unequal distribution, unbalanced distribution, domestic, right? And then extend it to, but we just discussed that in the morning. I think in terms of time and space, in terms of space, it reached out more than it needs. So what is the appetite? We said that it's beyond Asia, Europe, Africa, and Latin America, Pacific islands, and everything. So also it's 139 countries, right? And not to mention the billions, but all that. So what is the appetite? What is what I was asking? What is that urge? Right? For what? What image? What complete picture would satisfy him? It. I don't know, not him, but it. What is it? I don't know. Okay.
I think you're right when I said him.
Huh?
I think you're correct in saying him.
Him, you mean Xi Jinping? No, that is another question, second question. It doesn't start from him. It doesn't start from him. It doesn't start from 2013.
No, it's before.
A long ago, as we said, the discussion of sea power of Manhattan has been there for 30 years. And all the night from the 90s and 2000 and so on. So, and also recently there is a new group that said, if you want to talk about sea power, we need to go beyond Manhattan, go beyond military territory. Of course, they are doing this, right? But seizing the checkpoints. So that's energy, global resources. So there's a full control or dominance or feeling of security of all, right? So this is that 天下